You're really anxious to actually get into the nitty-gritty of editing on Vegas and moving things around and cutting them and doing all kinds of things. So let's start with a real quick overview of how all that works. So let's go ahead and start with a new project. So the Vegas interface is divided in half, basically. You have the timeline, which is where the media is placed and manipulated. And opposite that are your various windows. There's a bunch of tabs showing you the Explorer by default, and the master audio mixer and the preview. Now, if your windows aren't arranged this way, or you want to start over again, you can close Vegas and reopen it while you hold the Shift and Control keys, and that will boot everything up into the default configuration. For instance, if your timeline is on the top and not on the bottom, that's one of the preferences we can set. So let's go to Options, Preferences, and go over to the Display tab. Near the bottom you see this check mark by Display Timeline at bottom of main window, and if I uncheck that and click on Apply, you can see that they swap positions. The timeline is now on the top, which had been the default configuration for all the versions previous, the Vegas Pro 8. I like the timeline on the bottom, so I'm going to check that again and hit Apply and put that to where it was. But before I drop this AVI file onto the timeline, I want to make sure that the project properties are set to match my media. So I'm going to go over to the project properties button here, the little blue button, or you can hit Alt and Enter. At the very top of the video tab, it's defaulted to NTSC DV. Now NTSC is the color system that we use in North America. If you're in a country that uses PAL and you're working in PAL, you want to choose one of the PAL options. Or maybe you're working in HDV, you have options for that as well. But the idea is to set it to match your media, or at least set it to match most of the media you're using if you're using a variety of different types. So I'm going to grab this video and put it on the timeline. Now, keep your finger on the mouse button. You can just see this outline of the video and audio before it's actually dropped in. And notice in this case that this is a fairly lengthy piece of media and it extends beyond our view in the timeline here. But when I let go of the mouse, a few things are going to happen here. One will be it's going to create audio and video tracks because there aren't any now, and the video and audio have to live in tracks on the timeline. And also the timeline is going to resize to fit this whole piece of media in it. So I'm going to let go of the button, and all those things I said would happen actually happen. So the timeline has resized, the zoom factor basically, and we have created a video track and an audio track. Now one thing you may notice, depending on how fast your computer is and how long the media is, it's going to take a moment to create the waveforms that we see here on the timeline. And while that's happening, it's just going to say building peaks in the audio space there while it's doing that. So now that we have the media in the timeline, and from this point on, this media is going to be called a timeline event, because any individual element on the timeline we refer to as an event. So let's zoom in and out, and the easiest way to zoom in and out is to use your mouse scroll wheel Or also you can use the up and down arrows on your keyboard. The more media you add to the timeline, the handier that's going to be able to get a wide view and then zoom in to get a closer view to do some work on a particular area. So I'm going to add some more media here. Let's take this clip. I'm going to drop it in to the right of the event already in the timeline. And again, the timeline will move out to include the new event there. And again, we can zoom in and out. Now the place that it zooms in and out to is really determined by the cursor, which is the flashing black vertical line here. And the cursor functions as a playhead. And if we just click in a different spot on the timeline, the cursor will move, and now when the zoom happens, it's going to be centered around where the cursor is. Another way of getting around the timeline when you need to move left and right is to grab the scroll bar on the bottom and move it left and right, or you can just move your cursor to right where the ruler is, where it's having this time code readout, and you see the arrow turns into a little hand, and if you click and drag, you can just move the timeline around that way. The next thing that's handy to know is how you quickly go through the footage you have on your timeline, and you can do that with a time selection. So what I'm going to do here is just click where there's no media. I'm going to click at basically below the bottom track here, and as I click and drag, I'm creating that blue section, and that's a time selection. But also notice that in the preview, I'm just real quickly scrubbing through the video on that timeline event. That's a real quick way to go through your footage. If you want to play in real time, place your cursor where you want to start, and you can click just about anywhere on the timeline, above the ruler, below the last track, even on the media itself, although you'll be selecting it at the same time. Then hit the space bar, and now it's just going to play through from that point. And if you want it to stop playing, you can hit the space bar again. But look what happens. The cursor returns to its original position, which is actually pretty handy in most of editing. If you want it to stop where it's at the moment, you hit the Enter key instead. So I'm going to hit the space bar and hit the Enter key, and now it's stopped right where it was. So two different functions there, space bar and space bar again to return to your original point, or space bar and Enter to stop. Also, you can use the Enter key to start the playback as well. Another way you can do playback is to use the little transport buttons on the bottom here. And these work pretty much like a VCR buttons. You remember VCRs, don't you? The play button plays, pause button pauses. Just that simple. You have two other buttons here that will go to the very start of the project, and another one that goes right to the end of the project. One really cool feature of Vegas is that you don't actually have to stop the playback to jump to a different point. So I'm going to place the cursor at this point here and hit the space bar. It's playing through this wedding. And if I click above the ruler here, it's just going to jump right to that spot. Playback does not have to be interrupted. So you can jump anywhere in the timeline very quickly. So now that these events are in the timeline, how do we manipulate them, move them around, change them? Well, one thing is that you can click and drag, and that's how you could move things around. You can even move them vertically, and in this case it's going to create a new track. So let me undo that, and undo is Control Z. So you don't have to be afraid to experiment, because Control Z or undo will back you up the last 99 things you did. So don't worry about doing something wrong. You can always undo your way out of it. So what I want to do at this point is to create a crossfade between these two events on the timeline. And that's extremely simple in Vegas. You just need to grab one event and slide it on into another one. And you can see where that overlap happens. It's creating that cross indication, and also telling us exactly how long that overlap is. Right now it's reading 4 seconds and 28 frames. As I move this event further in, you can see that it's reading an even larger overlap. So let's keep it to 123 right now. I'm going to zoom in so we can get a better view here. And I'm going to play, and you can see one will crossfade into the other.